to talk about these paintings from his exhibition Momentum. And by the way, in case you don't know this, I find this a fascinating piece that Phil, in this garage now studio, made his work for many, many years without even having running water. I am moved by that kind of image and the dedication that it takes to pull that off. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about Phil, not a full bio. You can go to the website for that. But Phil is a teller of the story of place, both the exterior and the interior. So when I say that, I mean it's the outside world, but it's also what inhabits us. That is part of everything that he creates. As a brief introduction, he was born in Maine and graduated from Ellsworth High School. He has traveled and been in other places, including Syracuse University, where he received his BFA in painting. But he is grounded, he is rooted in this place of land and sky and water. It is everything about his work. And he calls this home, and he is busy translating all of this in his own very unique language so that we can all be part of what he is experiencing. I'm not sure he quite sees it that way, but that's how I experience it. His work is exhibited and collected nationally. So Phil, thank you very much for allowing me to be here with you for this conversation. So we're going to start. We have a little set of images that we're going to go through. As we do this, I want you to be fully aware that there are dozens and dozens more of this fabulous work on the Courthouse Gallery site, as well as in the facility itself, which, by the way, you can visit and be socially distanced very easily and be present for the work. I will say that it is compelling to see this work on screen, but it is even more compelling to see it in its physical state. So we're going to start with balance. And as I start to, I'll ask Phil questions. This is how this gig is going to work for everybody. I'm going to ask questions. And if Phil doesn't want this question and he has something else to say, he's going to go for it. So this is the dynamic. I'm starting with one of the smaller pieces in this show. It's an 8 by 10. Most of the work is much larger than this, but everything here is brush stroke. It's the movement of paint, bordering on the edges of abstraction, and yet it still holds on to that sense of real land, real landscape. And so I'm going to start this off, Phil, by asking you, how does this kind of pushing the edge relate to your more, I'm going to call it traditional, but it's not traditional work, your more vividly landscaped pieces? And how did you move into this aspect, and what's the connection?
Yes, excellent. But before I answer that question, I just want to say thank you to Karen and for you, Annaliese, for doing this. This is fantastic. So to answer that question, I think, as Karen knows, and you sort of saw when you were in my studio, is that the idea of pushing and pulling from abstraction to representation has been a thread throughout my career as an artist. And I have this sense of every once in a while wanting to sort of push those boundaries and discover a more not simplistic, but essential way of painting that sort of gives the gesture of the place. In this particular instance, this painting was, as you pointed out, what was the phrase you used? Not a more straight ahead landscape piece. It was a piece like that. And I did with this one, and then there's another one that's in the show and a few others, where I started going back and reversing the painting. So it was already painted, and I started simplifying bits of it.
Mm.
And so I was pulling back from the detail that I had put in, and discovering and revealing other aspects. And I've done this before, and I'll continue to do it. It is a fascinating process because I'm discovering things that I didn't necessarily see before.
Mm. Mm. I'm going to ask you another question as a little follow-up to that.
Yeah.
When you're saying discovering things that you didn't see before, this may have this may be intentional on your part, but what I find in this piece, and quite frankly, I find it in all of your work, there's an opening that occurs.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
in this particular space for me, and I'm not sure that the opening is the same for everybody, but it's up higher, it's between those two green bands, and it's like going into a deeper place. Are they intentional? Do you intentionally leave those openings, or do you discover them afterwards?
I think it's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of both, I think, because, as another artist said in a recent talk, Bill Irvin, he, we sometimes there's just each artist has sort of there's a thread in their work, and that thread of a window or a door or an opening has seemingly always been there in my work in one way or another. And it's not like I always intentionally do it, but I gravitate towards places that have that. Like, for instance, this when I painted this scene, I had originally painted, as I said before, on site a piece, and that's what I gravitate towards, is sort of those places. You're walking through the woods or whatever, and then this light is coming through, not a literal doorway, obviously, but it's this, as you described, this space, this opening, from which you can go from here to there and back again.
Mm-hmm. And for me, it always appears to be not just the geographical space, it's a depth space that brings me someplace moderately unknown or even unknowable.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect there too. Okay.
Yeah. Shall we move to the next one?
Yeah, yeah. So this is, we're going from an 8x10 to a 36x48, by the way. So it's a big leap here. It's Luminous Harbor. And opening in this also, upper right-hand corner to me pulls me right through. So this for me is an example of the extraordinary in the ordinary. So I would wonder if you would talk to how much of lived experience is important to you when you make a work. This is alive with lived experience to me.
Yeah, the sense of place is very important to me, as you noted earlier and in your essay. And so it's one of the reasons or that I'm drawn to sort of the working waterfront or these working harbors is this is just ripe with years, decades and decades of hard work, and the stories that could be told in those places. And in this particular place, which is Portland Harbor, I mean, you can see how it's almost like an archaeological dig when you go there, because somebody has patched this on that, they've repaired the wharf, and these boats are constantly being repaired. So it's all that texture, that grit, that life that's there.
So that's all part of the capture for you.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Tell us a little bit when you're talking about this, and you mentioned even about being on site when we were talking just a second ago. What's your process like?
Yeah, it's usually pre-pandemic. It was a lot of on-site work, sketching, and then little studies. There would be marker sketches and pencil sketches, and then small studies. And like this piece has a little 8x10 that was a study for it. And then I'm looking at that piece, and not only the sketch and maybe in a photograph as well when I'm back in the studio. And I'm looking at all of those things together, and I'm trying to pull out what is most important to me in terms of the image. And then that on-site painting has those gestures and those immediate marks that, as we sort of talked about in the studio, when you're painting on site, there's a more immediacy to that process. And so that's the general process. And then I start, on a bigger piece like this, if I'm very excited about the smaller ones. And then this sort of during the pandemic, I switched to working more from photographs and more from the stuff that I have in my studio. And I've been going back out doing some plein air here and there.
Okay, all right. Because most of these paintings, just so everybody knows, have been created in 2020.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're living in these times. So it's huge.
Before
Yes.
you guys move on, I just want to say it's one of my favorite paintings in the show. I mean, I don't know how you did it, Phil, but that line of those light colored buildings in the background, the way you picked it up in the foreground with the barrel, and that bright white next to that barrel, and then all the pillars and the barrels, and I mean, it's just fascinating. You could never it wouldn't matter if it was a boat or what, or just totally abstract, but the relationship between, the shapes of the building, the pier, and the boat, it's just fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you. If I may say something a little bit too about sort of the top portion and the bottom portion of the painting, is that I was trying to work very diligently at simplifying a lot of those shapes and abstracting those shapes of a building, and pushing it as far as I could go in terms of abstraction, and still read it as, there's a boat, there's a building, and so forth. So
yeah, and the not to interrupt, the interrelationship of the angles is just fascinating, how everything works with each other. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So shall we move on to the next one, since we're...
Yeah. So here we have liquids and solids, and talk to us about these rocks.
Yes.
Yeah, talk to us about that.
For me, this is a super exciting painting, a very exciting painting, because I was out with my girlfriend Isabella, and we were on Schoodic, and we're at low tide out Schoodic on the eastern side. And there's this beach at low tide where there's just these amazing rocks, from bigger to smaller to even smaller ones. Some are like car size and some are, little pebbles, but they've all been rounded by the surf. And so I took a series of photographs, and then came back into the studio and started looking at some of these. And this piece for me was a watershed piece, in the sense that I was pushing myself to use more neutral tones and against some more brighter, more pure hues, like the blues and up above in the water. And also, what else was happening was I was trying to get the sort of the feeling of being on that beach, and the feeling of the rocks, and the feeling of the warmth of that summer day. And there's a lot of stuff that I was doing in this painting that I haven't done in other paintings, except here and there, was using palette knife, and I've started using these large, various size squeegees, where I lay the paint down, and then I will scrape it back off, and then I'll scrape it across and discover these marks that happen. And it gives the paint a very different texture. And then I can create these sharper edges, or do kind of what I was saying before, this idea of almost like an archaeological dig in terms of the painting itself, where I can scrape away and see stuff that comes up from underneath those surfaces, and then decide if I want to go back over. Like there's that brush stroke that's on the bottom right of the painting, that sort of creamy colored brush stroke. I want it to come back and reinsert the surface of the painting, you know, that this is a brush stroke, but it also still reads in terms of being part of the painting.
Mm.
You know, I just want to say something about this painting real quick too. It's interesting you said all that, Phil, because I was thinking, I mean, looked at this one quite a lot, and it is different from a lot of your work, how you handled the paint, which you just answered, because it feels like wet cement or creamy butter. You know what I mean? It feels, you can feel the moisture if you touch those rocks. At least I feel like I can. It was a very exciting painting, and you know, it's interesting that you said, you know, maybe it is the palette knife and all that stuff that's been doing it, but the consistency of the paint in this one is different than a lot of your other work.
It is, and I think too, over the years, I've been slowly building up, it seems like thicker paint, and in some paintings I overdo it and they don't work, but this one worked. So it's that building up, and then the ability to scrape back down to the surface and then build back up again is just a process of fun discovery.
And it's the contrast too, I think also, Karen, when you're saying that, is that sense of the gray tones, those neutral tones up against the brown, you know, the way they ply each other is really very interesting also. So.
Yeah, and the lavenders and the blues that are coming through, you know, so that it's not a dull, you know, sometimes it's challenging to paint with those colors, I would think, you know, and still make them feel warm. And brown is another thing that I think is challenging for artists to paint with, you know, not to be too dull. But this is very rich. I mean, I think it's just beautiful.
Thank you. Shall we move on to the next?
Yes. And so now we're getting bigger. This is emerging patterns. This is 30 by 40. This is a lot of shapes, or it feels like geometric shapes in this. Could you speak to that, of this must be this is a familiar place to you.
Yes.
What surprises you in a familiar place, and what brings you back there for a painting like this?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of places that I've revisited many times, including this spot. And I think for me to continue to be kind of excited about the place or the painting or what have you, is I try to investigate or play with the compositions and try to find unusual angles and unusual unexpected sort of vantage points when I am working on a piece. And I think part of it is, for me, the structure of a painting is there's a structure there, but sometimes I'm working with this sort of geometric structure, as you pointed out, but sometimes I try to break it apart and break the logic of the structure a little bit, in terms of, you know, maybe it's a pop of color or a shape that doesn't seem to quite fit in that spot, and kind of disrupt it a little bit in a sense. And that sort of keeps me kind of interested in, engaged in the piece. It's sort of like I'm discovering something there.
And once again, we have, you know, what Karen was pointing out before, is that white in the background, that structure, that building, that's an immense light magnet, okay, that pulls us there also.
Yeah, and I think, again, sort of just briefly before we move on to the next, is that it's this sort of this deep object, the shadow, and this object in deep shadow, and then the light coming through from behind it.
Mhm.
It's like one of those things when you're going along and all of a sudden you're like, wow, look at that, and you want to try to express that somehow.
What happens to you, Phil, when you see a wow like that and you're not painting? Or are you always in your head sort of painting?
I think I am sort of absorbing that and painting. It's like uh,
Mhm.
it when I'm caught by some kind of phenomena like that, I try to sit with it and absorb it and just be with it. And I don't necessarily have to draw it or paint it. I can just sort of like, oh, okay, that's that feeling. That's that. And so it's doesn't always have to be. I don't always have to put something down. And other times, if I happen to have my phone on me, I'll snap a few photos of it so I can sort of grab that moment and then go back to the studio and work.
And I bet your memory is very fine-tuned.
I think so. I try. So I'm thinking we should move on because
Yep,
we're
yep.
at,
On balance, could you talk about the movement in this piece?
yeah. With me, there's movement is a hugely important thing in every one of my pieces, and this one in particular, I started I started with a blank canvas, and I had some leftover paint on my palette, and I knew that I wanted to create something very descriptive of clouds and water and sky, but just extremely simplified. That expressed sort of that feeling of being near the water, on the water, with clouds and sky, and just loading up the brush and just painting it, um, and just reacting to whatever I had put down on the canvas. And that's how I worked with this particular piece.
Yeah, and it's fascinating as we go through, and I won't take up a lot of time here, but that sense of clouds and how your clouds are made in different paintings, you
Yeah,
know, that movement of clouds and what they are. Yeah.
yeah. And this next one has some of those clouds
Hmm.
a different way.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that sense also of, I'm a writer. So what happens for me is I tend to put story into a lot of your pieces, and I'm not sure that you do or that any other viewer really does. But in a piece like this, in this distance, in those blocks of color, I've got safety and adventure, and I've got tranquility and danger. And so it's very interesting how every one of your pieces is loaded with storytelling for me. So
Fantastic.
yeah.
I love it. I
So
love it.
yeah. And for you, you don't go there. That's not what happens for you.
Not necessarily that there's no particular narrative that I'm interested in. But I love that, I mean, we're thinking beings, so, we might, as you're describing, you might put this narrative on the piece. But for me, it's this sort of drawn to whatever view
Mhm.
or place or what have you, and it's sort of the shapes, it's the structure, it's the light, it's the vastness. In this particular sense, it's like how it's sort of when you're in a place like on the coast of Maine, especially Scudic or whatever, wherever you are. Um, as you described, there's this boldness of the rocks and the coast, and then this vast expanse, and then this water and sky and so forth. And here I was trying to um, bring all of those together somehow, and I didn't want to lend too much detail to the rocks and the trees and so forth. And I was more interested in sort of um, kind of breaking up the surface and simplifying the shapes of the rocks, and then at some point leaving that behind and having that structure come out on its own in terms of kind of like a more of an abstract piece where but it's still reading as rocks and water and such,
Mhm.
kind
Yeah,
of disrupting it a little bit or fracturing it, if you might
yeah.
use it.
We could dive right in there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Shall we do the next one?
Yep. And here we have Surf and Stone. I'm going to say that rarely do we get clouds, in my opinion, that are talking about the images we often see in the sky, or that's the way I'm reading those clouds. So talk about where this is in these stones and the movement of the water a little bit, or whatever you want to say. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. This is out at Schoodic looking at Moose Island, and it's a spot I've painted a bunch of times, and it's a fairly famous spot for painters. Marsden Hartley, I think, did a painting called Crashing Wave at Schoodic somewhere on this spot or in that area. And it's a place of elements. You know, it's really elemental there. And uh, and I think what I was trying to do when I was there, I did a small piece on site and then came back to the studio, and I wanted to kind of describe some of that elemental, the elemental feeling of being on those rocks and near that water, and again that sort of the distance um, and but on a different kind of day as from the last painting, you know.
mm-hmm. Yeah. That sense that when you've said before that sense of, the middle of the day steals the light,
Yes.
so that sense of where the different light pieces are is always moving to me. Yeah.
Yeah. And also too, playing here, sometimes I feel like this happens in some pieces where if I feel, I'll try that again. If I feel like I'm getting stuck in sort of conventional ways of making marks for myself, I start to want to break that convention and discover a new way of making marks and putting that in the piece or bringing that in. And if I in here, that's what I was playing with.
Yeah. Okay. And here we have Inside, which is the only image we have in this this exhibit tonight that we're showing this talk. So talk about the angles in this, in the bold colors and the ricocheting.
I like that word that you used in the essay, the ricocheting of the angle. And it's interesting because, when this was from, I was going through some images on my computer of interior shots, and I had done several paintings of this space over the years. And I did another painting called The Ball in the Hall, which was painted from at the bottom of the stairs looking across at that door. And I had taken all these photographs, and I'm looking, and some of them were just really compelling. And when you're taking photographs, sometimes the angles are just wacky on your phone. And if I were to be sketching there, I might automatically adjust all of those angles to be, parallel and perpendicular and, all of that stuff, plumb and level and all that. But I decided not to do that. I decided to make these sort of, as you said, ricocheting angles, because it afforded me all this opportunity to make all these really fun shapes that really worked with the painting. And again, as you obviously hear, there's a door and a clear doorway and some light coming through.
Right. And so once again, even when we're inside, we have outside. We have another opening, that goes right out to the outside. So yeah.
Yeah.
So vast view. I want to ask, in this expanse, how has your approach to landscape, the language you use, changed over time? Or has it?
That's a good question. Well, I think part of it, early on when I was doing watercolors, I had this sense of almost looking at the landscape like, say, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with um, Japanese or Chinese prints or paintings, scroll paintings, that they're um, uh, they go from, it's a different perspective. It's from top to bottom and bottom to top, in terms of, things at the top are further away, things at the bottom are closer. That still is here in this, but and that's kind of how I was painting early on in watercolor, in a sense. But over the years, I've tried to look at things in terms of almost layers,
Mm.
in terms of, you've got the layer in the front, and then the water, and then the mountains, and then the land masses, and then the sky, and almost in terms of uh, theater, in a sense. Theater has all these I think the word is scrims,
Yes.
that come down and create depth in a very shallow, bit. Um, so there's a bit of that happening here.
Interesting. And I love the use of the greens. The greens are just so fabulous the way they're playing with each other.
Oh, thanks, thanks. I discovered this color. What was it?
Mm.
Cadmium green last year, and that's that sort of electric green in the bottom.
Yeah, yeah. Oof. And yeah,
So, shall we move on to the?
let's move on because we'll run out of time.
Yeah, we'll
I
run
know I do.
keep going.
Yeah. So nestled here, we have, this is another large painting. The one before was also 30 by 40. So talk about, once again, we have angles and your choices and where you cut things off, and talk about that a little bit here.
I think again, it's like, if we briefly go back to that piece,
Mhm.
compositionally they're extremely similar. They've got a lot of the angles that are cutting off the corners of the canvas, and it's a way of me exploring composition and keeping myself kind of interested in looking at things in a different way. I think is what's happening there, as well as sort of maybe telling a story. Like what, those boats that have some history to them.
Mhm.
But it's mostly about sort of having fun with the formal structure of the painting, in terms of angles and structure and unusual composition that is compelling to
And the
me.
shadows and light there too are just fabulous.
Thank you.
I gotta say, what gets me about that painting is it's just the colors. I
Uh-huh.
mean, the colors on that beam in the foreground, but I don't know what that contraption is. It's going over that beam, that sort of bluish color in the front. It, I mean, that's,
Oh,
yeah,
that,
right there, Phil. Right there, Phil. That's really beautiful. I mean, and you wouldn't think anybody would pay attention to that, but it's beautiful. And
yep,
then the green on the bottom of that dinghy on the left there with the little blue seat,
yep,
and the way you've got the shadows on it from the benches and everything. And then you get to the red boat and you've got that sort of, bluish turquoise. I guess it's a bumper hanging off the side of the dinghy,
yep.
and the orange and the pink, and then the purple behind, and the blue in the water, by the pillars. I mean, it just wouldn't even matter what it was. It just,
Yeah, it's true.
I never get tired of looking at this painting. It's beautiful.
Oh,
And the colors are
well,
beautiful. And the spatial relationships in particular, you really feel the depth inside those little dinghies there. The structure of it, I think, it's exceptional.
thank you. Well, I
And
think,
it's all boxed in that little, the little walkway and just a little
Yeah.
tiny, yeah.
The
yeah,
composition's great too. I mean, the way it's cropped in there and everything, you're really focused on that little section,
Mhm.
right with the dinghies and that little beam. you know, on the pier there.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's just the way it's painted. It's just really, I think it's really fascinating. And this is a large painting too. It's 30 by 40.
Yeah. And it looks so intimate and small when you look at it on the screen.
Yeah,
Right.
It doesn't look that way, so it's important to point out.
When you see it, when you walk into a room and it's hanging on the wall, it draws you right in, you know, and you never get tired of looking at it. And you know, in the gallery, we look at a lot of paintings for, you know, sometimes a long time, and you know, but this one holds its own for a long time. You don't get tired.
Well, it's also, not to interrupt, Karen, but it's also that sense of, you know, if you can really look at a painting over and over again like that, and you still are finding things to pull you in almost in a new way, then that's pretty remarkable, and that's a powerful work.
Yeah, even if you just looked at the shadows that are going on inside those boats, they're interesting and fascinating, and they're quite complex.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't feel busy. You know what I mean? There's a lot of harmony in that painting as well.
Yes.
And a lot of little surprises, even the little boards going across the pier there with the, you know, the little teal and then the little lightish green and the patterns that are created there. You know, and then on that one pier there, Phil, there's that one little splash of light orange right there. Yeah. Yeah, just little things like that. This painting is chock full of them.
Well, it's kind of,
In a good way. Yeah.
It's interesting because it's, you know, it's really, I'm trying to notice sort of just ordinary / extraordinary things. You know, we think they might be ordinary, but they're extraordinary, so to speak. And it's also those things like that little splash of color there. That was a discovery at the end of the painting, because it wasn't there in the beginning of the painting, but I did that because there was sort of like something needs to be there, something, and I sampled like a color from another part of the painting and put that in. It's like, oh, that's what needed to be there. So it's
what you said about it being ordinary and extraordinary, because you could walk by these dinghies every day on the way to your boat and never give them a second look.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, until you see the way you've highlighted them.
Yeah. And I think if we move to the next one, it's sort of the same kind of thing, a different subject, but these little spring flowers. Did you have a thought on these, Annaliese?
It's the spring flowers, but it's that field of all those greens. Okay, that, you know, all of those greens. And for me also, there is, well, I was using the word scrim in my mind, is that sense of in the background, the darkness and all that light just behind it is quite remarkable.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
This was another one of those discoveries of, these little, I call them wild violets, but they're unbeknownst to me, they're actually called bluettes. So a botanist I am not. But you know, these sort of, they come up in these little bunches in the spring in my lawn, and there's these gorgeous little flowers, and you know, they're probably about a clump about the size of your hand. And so I was down on my knees with my camera taking photographs of these things, and trying to get the angle that I wanted, and sort of that feel, and get close up to these, because I just thought they were just so incredible.
And much like with that interior shot, I want to point out that in the actual exhibition, there are a number of florals, the flowers that show up, because Phil also has a fabulous garden that he tends.
It's one of the things that has happened, you know, because of the pandemic, is I spent a lot of time in my garden this spring. So
Yeah.
And this isn't my garden, the next one, but it's of Hancock Point, doing some painting some lupins, and again that sort of layer of the up close and the middle and in the further parts of the landscape. Maybe we won't say much about this one. We'll move on to
Can you put some others? Yeah, this is a great one.
Spacious clouds, skies, all those clouds. So I would say talk a little bit about how you handle those clouds. And it's interesting to me, those clouds versus the next image also.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, when we look at that and we go back to that, and this, it's, again, part of my painting practice, and so to speak, is just noticing things. And sometimes it's just, it's if I'm out on a walk somewhere or a hike, or it's noticing how the clouds move and how they do what they do, and how the sky does what it does, and the water and all of that. And so I was trying to emulate that movement, particularly in this one, and the movement of the water and the movement of the clouds. And it's really kind of hard to tell in this piece, but they're painted really thickly. I mean,
you can tell.
This is super thick. And it's part of that kind of really thick application to kind of assert the presence of whatever shape it is. And then again, here in this painting, in the lower half, I used a squeegee again to scrape away some things, some paint, and then add back on. And so to then relate it to the next one,
right.
I moved it even further in terms of abstraction and simplification, and kind of asserting the brushstroke on the painting in terms of, well, this one's called Approaching Rain, Deep Waters. So it's, when you're out there looking at some of the phenomena of the rain coming, it's kind of putting that in there, but doing it in kind of a kind of an abstract way, just sort of this trapezoidal shape that's coming across the water.
And I love in both of these, that sense of the horizontal band movement and the allocation, your choices in the allocation of the real estate, how much is sky, how much is water, with this little band of, and the power that each one of those choices brings.
Yeah, and it's interesting for me, when we go back to this one, that you're describing the allocation of sky versus land versus water, and then this is reversed. And the next one is sort of that similar, as it's the opposite. So it's giving that, it's playing with those. And I don't know how many, Karen knows, I've done a lot of paintings that have this kind of setup. There's this big sky, and there's an island in the middle, and then there's a reflection. And I challenge myself every once in a while. It's like, I just love that sort of structure, and how can I do it again? How can I do it so it inserts some vigor into the painting, and some new shapes and some new colors. And here it was limiting myself to a very narrow band of color.
Right. That sense of palette in what you're choosing, and this is like a solitary little world there. And so that brings up how do you choose that, or does it choose you, that sense of what your palette is, or do you know going into ahead of time what you're going to use? Or
sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I just start painting and seeing what happens, and because I have the usual suspects sitting on my palette, the tubes of color. Other times I will limit them purposefully, and okay, I'm just going to use this blue and that blue, and then maybe a little bit of the turquoise or whatever, and this and some white and this. And part of that happens from working with my students of having, torturing them through having them limit their palettes. And so I figured I probably should do it myself. Although I did do a lot of that in school, where you're way back, where you actually limited things very purposefully. And for me, it's this sort of challenge. How can I describe this with this limited set? And it forces me to discover new things, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, and with everything that you do, to my eye, there's a punch of color. Even if you've got a limited palette, that color is driving. Color and light seem to be actual characters in your work.
Yes.
They take over the stage, and the color and light are playing, they're performing.
Yeah. It's funny that you say that, because I did this time-lapse video of a commission piece that I did years ago, and I kind of tongue-in-cheek at the end of it rolled these credits, main characters, brush, paint, light, color, it was sort of kind of cheesy. So maybe we could end on this one.
Treetop Twilight, a big one, 24 by 30, or big enough. And this is, as Phil has said, the last image. And so before we open it up to questions, so one of the things is you often talk about the changingness of the quality of place is what you most want to convey. Does this speak to that in some way to you? That changingness of quality? I mean, there's so much in this painting, and yet it's so. Phil has a meditation practice, and so this piece feels all of that. There's a.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's sort of, the changingness of place is the sort of the truth of what is, right? Things are constantly changing, and so I think a part of it is like when I am out, hiking somewhere or walking somewhere, and you're compelled to sort of stop and look at what's there, or if by force of habit one is compelled to just stop and notice. This is what happens sometimes. In this particular instance, it was one of a hike that I've done many, many times, and coming around, and it's a view I had seen many times, but the light, was obviously, it was different than I had seen it before, and it just caught me. And I happened to have my gear with me, so I started to paint and do a small piece, and then this is the larger one. But it's that presentness and the changingness of place, and how the phenomena change. And one of the things that's fascinating about painting Maine, especially if you're on the top of a mountain like this, and this was Beach Mountain, and you could have a day like today where there's lots of clouds and wind and stuff happening, and this is sort of what that day was like, that you have all this stuff changing, that like what do you paint as it's going along, so you make a mark, and then it's changed, and then you make another mark, and the scene has changed again. So you are just painting and sort of going as things are changing, and then you decide, okay, there it is, it's done. And of course, when I think we're sort of in accord with things, the changingness of things, there's this kind of relaxation that happens, and it's quite wonderful.
Yeah. And when you're saying that, also it occurs to me that sense of the intimate in the universal, is another aspect of this, which, quite moving.
Thank you.
Anyway, that's really good, Annaliese and Phil. I think that kind of ends the slideshow presentation, and we'd like to open it up to questions. If anybody would like to ask Phil or Annaliese any questions.
Ask Phil.
You can raise your hand, and we will ask you to unmute, is how we usually do it.
How is it different when someone commissions you to do something as opposed to you just deciding to paint something?
Good question, Pixie. Well, it's interesting. It kind of depends on the person kind of commissioning the piece. Sometimes people have a very particular idea that they want.
Like me.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes it's like super particular, and so it can be. And other times people just want me to just paint a particular view that they have in mind and give me kind of free rein in terms of what I am inspired by.
Mm-hmm.
So it really kind of depends on the person, and sometimes it can be a little bit challenging because it's not what I may have been inspired by in particular. It's what the person is inspired by. So I kind of have to sit with things for a while and kind of look at that particular view or that idea and discover what's compelling.
Mm-hmm.
Does that kind of?
I think does that answer your question, Pixie?
Oh yeah, it did.
Okay.
Karen, this is Kate.
Oh, okay, Kate. Yes, go ahead.
I couldn't find the raise the hand thing. I'm kind of a
At the
novice.
bottom, you have to open your participants. If you open your participants, it's at the bottom. You can raise your hand.
Oh, okay. Well, here I am.
Yeah.
How's it going?
Hi, Phil. It's good to see you. And the range of work. It's just wonderful. I think what I've always loved about your work and continue to love about your work is that it really looks like you're enjoying yourself.
Oh, I'm having a blast. Yeah, it's so much fun.
So one thing I noticed is that the distance or the nearness or the distance from the picture plane in the different paintings, and what determines that, or how far you are from the picture plane? Am I making sense?
You mean the horizon line, or?
Well, no. How close it feels that you are to the surface, or how?
To the objects themselves?
Yeah, is that a conscious choice, or how is that determined?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a conscious choice or not. That's a really good question. I think, yeah, sometimes I'm just sort of scanning the paintings on the side there. Sometimes I feel like I'm further away, and in terms of some of the paintings, other times I think there's this of being really up close to it, and it's that idea of sort of trying to create this sort of depth in a piece, and maybe that's what's happening there. I'm not sure if that's answered.
I like the variation, and it just adds more excitement to the strokes and the fact that it varies.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, thinking about one of my artists that has inspired my work over the years, Matisse, he does a lot of that in terms of, and I look at other artists that sort of flip that picture plane up and flatten things out. There's, in a sense, if I'm saying that right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Congratulations.
Thanks, Kate.
We have a question from Bruce.
Hi. My question is, do you talk a lot about challenging yourself in all sorts of ways, and you're clearly in love with Maine. I mean, it's just, you know, your shirt is part of it, and I wondered if you've ever wondered about going elsewhere, the desert, you know, urban scapes. I mean, you're always. I mean, a lot of times you're pushing toward you know, abstract forms,
Yes.
and that I've seen I've every time I go to Ellsworth and go to the gallery, I see your work, and I had not noticed your love of abstract forms quite as much as I have by listening to your talk today. So I was just wondering if going to another scape would, you know, have you ever thought about it? Would it have, I'm sure it would have an effect on your painting.
Yes, yeah, and I have. I mean, I've traveled lots of different places over the years, and a couple winters ago, not this past winter, but winter before last, went down to the Exuma and did a little bit of painting down there. And the color was quite different, and that certainly influenced my painting. And I've done a few cityscapes, you know, down in Portland and then the West Coast, because my parents live out that way. And so, but definitely, I mean, there's places I would love to go. You know, Greece would be one, Italy, and kind of see what that would do to my work, and sort of those particular places, you know, how that would affect it.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Bruce.
I really enjoyed your talk today.
Thanks.
And the questions as well. The Annaliese, I enjoyed your commentary. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce. We have a question from Linda.
Hi, Linda.
Hi. I just want to say I love your work, and thank you for such good descriptions of what you're thinking when you're painting. But my question is, what's your palette of colors? Do you use a limited palette at all, or your colors are just stunningly beautiful?
Thank you. Yeah, I have sort of the usual suspects of, you know, my palette. It's let's see if I can rattle them off. You know, it's ultramarine blue, manganese blue, and viridian, sap green, and then there's quinacridone magenta, and then transparent earth red, and cadmium orange, cadmium yellow, and then maybe a cadmium red in there, and then some earth tones that I throw in white. And these days I've been trying, you know, with the one that was liquids and solids, the rock one that it was sort of the watershed piece. I was using some pre-mixed sort of grays, and using those as the foundation, and then adding color to those.
Wow, excellent. Okay, thank you.
I'd like to thank Phil and Annaliese very much. This is a wonderful presentation, and we really enjoyed having the show and having you both with us. And if there's no more questions, I guess I wish everybody a good evening, and hope you have a wonderful dinner and enjoy this blustery weather we're having up here in Maine today.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. And thank you, Karen.
unmute yourself and give Phil and Annaliese a nice round of applause, or say hello. Go ahead, feel free, and I'll do the clapping. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks. Thank you, Bill. It was good.
Thank you,
And
Annaliese.
I
Love
would
the
say,
Cadillac mountain photo. I mean, not
thank
photo.
you, Annaliese.
you're welcome. And I would say, get into the gallery where you could really see the work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
It's really remarkable to see it in real time, in physical space, you know. And as I said, this is a gallery that's big enough that we can be safe.
Yes.
yeah. People have been wonderful about wearing masks and social distancing in the gallery, and it's pretty airy and spacious. And
Yeah.
so.
And thank you, Karen, so much for hosting this. This was great.
Yeah.
very smoothly. And Annaliese, I love that back and forth was fantastic. It was
Well,
Yeah.
you're great. And thanks to everybody for spending their dinner hour almost sort of with us. We're very glad to have everyone. So thanks.
All right. Well,
Bye.
good night.
Bye.
Sign off. Bye-bye.
thanks.
Bye.